The Alcatraz Escape, 1962. They called it escape-proof, not just secure, not just heavily guarded, escape-proof. The U.S. government staked its reputation on it. A maximum security federal prison dropped on a cold, fog-choked island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by tidal currents violent enough to kill a healthy swimmer. For 29 years, that reputation held. Then one morning in June 1962, guards walked into 3 cells and found the beds occupied, until they looked closer. The sleeping figures weren't men, they were heads, painted plaster, real human hair, and the actual men were gone. Here's how they did it. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, specifically transferred there because he kept escaping from other prisons. He was patient, methodical, and dangerously intelligent. The brothers John and Clarence Anglin occupied the cells beside him. The 3 had known each other before. Now, in the world's most famous inescapable prison, they made a plan. For months, they carved through the concrete walls of their cells, using spoons sharpened against the floor and a drill cobbled together from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor. Morris played accordion every night. The music covered the sound of grinding stone. To hide the holes during the day, fake ventilation grills, sculpted from papier-mâché stripped from library magazines. The dummy heads were their masterstroke, made to fool night guards doing light checks, buying the real men hours of lead time. On the night of June 11th, they vanished. Through a utility corridor, up 3 stories of plumbing pipes, through the roof, down a 4-story drain pipe, some into San Francisco Bay, on a raft hand-stitched from over 50 stolen raincoats. The FBI searched for years. No bodies, no credible sightings. The case was officially closed in 1979 with the conclusion they had drowned. The U.S. Marshals Service still lists it open. In 2018, a letter surfaced addressed to the FBI. It allegedly read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. Yes, we all made it that night." The handwriting analysis came back inconclusive. To this day, no one knows. The Maze Prison Mass Escape, 1983. The British government had a name for the Maze Prison, and the name was a warning. Not a facility, not a detention center, a maze. Built 10 miles outside Belfast at the height of Northern Ireland's troubles, it was a prison inside a detention center inside an army base. Razor wire on razor wire, watchtowers with overlapping sightlines. Armed soldiers between every checkpoint. Officially designated the most secure prison in Europe. On September 25, 1983, 38 men walked out of it. The planning had taken over a year. IRA prisoners inside H Block 7 had done the impossible. Smuggled 6 handguns and multiple knives past one of the most heavily monitored security operations in the United Kingdom. At 2:45 p.m., the afternoon shift resumed. That was the signal. Simultaneously, across the block, some prisoners seized guards. 24 warders were taken at gunpoint. They were beaten, stripped of their uniforms, their keys, their identity cards, locked in a utility closet. Then came the move that made this escape different from every other in British history. The prisoners didn't dig. They didn't climb. They commandeered the prison food truck, a vehicle that made routine runs through the internal gates, and forced the driver at gunpoint to drive them straight through the security checkpoints. One officer died of a heart attack. 2 were shot. 20 more were injured. Outside, the IRA had assembled 100 armed members to receive them, but a 5-minute miscalculation meant no vehicles were waiting. The men came flooding out of the gates and found empty fields. They scattered, hijacked cars, ran through crops in the fading afternoon light, in stolen guard uniforms, with guns in their hands and every checkpoint in Northern Ireland being activated around them. Margaret Thatcher read the classified briefing and wrote, "Even worse than we thought," across the top. Of the 38, 15 were recaptured that same day. 19 eventually reached the Republic of Ireland. 4 made it to the United States. 1 was never found. The largest prison break in British history, and it almost worked completely. Pascal Payet's 2 helicopter escapes, 2001 and 2007. Here is something no prison architect in history ever seriously planned for. What if the escape came from above? Every security system ever built around a prison assumes the threat is horizontal. Walls to prevent climbing out, fences to prevent cutting through, tunnels to prevent digging under. Pascal Payet, French career criminal and convicted murderer, found the one direction no one was watching. In October 2001, at Luynes prison in southern France, an unscheduled helicopter appeared over the courtyard. It landed. Payet climbed aboard. It lifted off. By the time guards understood what was happening, he was gone. He was recaptured in 2003, transferred to Grass Prison, a high-security facility chosen presumably because authorities had learned their lesson. They had not. On July 14th, 2007, Bastille Day, France's national holiday, a second hijacked helicopter descended onto the roof of Grass Prison. Payet emerged from the roof access, boarded the aircraft, and was airborne before a single alarm reached the right person. He was recaptured again weeks later in Spain. 2 helicopter escapes from 2 different high-security prisons using 2 different hijacked aircraft. The aftermath reshaped prison design across Europe. Facilities that had never considered air threats were forced to install anti-landing nets, rooftop barriers, and restricted airspace protocols. The French government was forced to admit it had never, at a systemic level, thought to look up. Payet didn't expose a flaw in one prison's security. He exposed a flaw in how every prison in the world had been designed. The sky was always open. He was simply the first to use it. The Texas 7, 2000, they didn't tunnel out. They didn't cut through a fence. They didn't overpower a guard at a gate. They put on uniforms and walked. On December 13, 2000, 7 inmates escaped from the John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security facility in Kennedy, Texas, in what would become the most audacious prison break in the state's history. And the key to the whole thing wasn't physical at all, it was psychological. George Rivas was the architect. He was serving 18 consecutive life sentences for burglary and kidnapping, which meant he had nothing to lose and every reason to plan carefully. He assembled 6 others, including 2 convicted murderers. Their plan: exploit a scheduled maintenance window when supervision in the maintenance area thinned. They overpowered 2 guards and 8 maintenance workers. I locked them in a utility closet, stripped them of everything: uniforms, IDs, tool belts, keys. Then Rivas's team spread out across the facility, dressed as staff, moving with authority, speaking the language of the institution, presenting credentials to every checkpoint they encountered. Every single one let them through. They walked out of a maximum security Texas prison because they acted like they belonged there. Not one guard raised an alarm. What happened next was worse. The group armed themselves, crossed state lines, assumed false identities. On Christmas Eve 2000, they robbed a sporting goods store in Irving. When police officer Aubrey Hawkins arrived, he was shot 11 times and killed. The full weight of American law enforcement came down on them. America's Most Wanted ran all 7 faces. One member, Larry Harper, died by suicide before capture. The remaining 6 were arrested in January 2001 at a Colorado motorhome park. 5 were executed. 1 had a sentencing error identified and received life imprisonment instead. The escape lasted 38 days. The damage it left behind lasted much longer. El Chapo's mile-long tunnel, 2015. Watch this carefully, because this is the moment one of the most powerful men on Earth simply ceased to exist on a security camera, and the world spent 6 months trying to understand how. July 11, 2015. Altiplano Federal Prison, Mexico. 8:52 p.m. The facility's internal cameras tracked Joaquin El Chapo Guzman as he paced his cell. He was considered the most dangerous prisoner in Mexican custody, the head of the Sinaloa cartel, convicted of running the world's largest drug trafficking operation, already escaped from prison once before in 2001. The government had placed him in Altiplano specifically because no one had ever escaped from it. He stepped behind the shower partition. The camera saw him go in. It never saw him come out. Beneath the shower floor was a 20-inch square trapdoor. Below that, a ladder. And below that, a tunnel. Not a rough-cut crawl space. A fully engineered underground corridor, nearly 1 mile long, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. Built, it was later confirmed, to match Guzman's exact height so he could move through without crouching. Ventilation piping ran the full length. Electric lighting lined the walls, and on a set of rails running the entire distance sat a modified motorcycle used during construction to haul tons of excavated soil out of the tunnel and away from the site. The exit surfaced inside a house that Guzman's associates had purchased on the open market months earlier, directly outside the prison perimeter. His sons had coordinated the operation. Cartel lieutenants had managed logistics. 7 prison officials were later charged with complicity. The Guzman was flown to Sinaloa that same night. He spent the next 6 months at large, at one point sitting down for a secret interview with Hollywood actors while one of the largest manhunts in Mexican history searched for him. He was recaptured January 8, 2016, extradited to the United States in 2017, convicted in 2019. He now sits in ADX Florence, the American supermax in Colorado, under permanent lockdown. The tunnel took months to build. The escape took seconds to execute. The Great Escape. Stalag Luft III, 1944. Before we tell you what happened on the night of March 24, 1944, you need to understand what the Germans thought they had built. Stalag Luft III was a Luftwaffe-run prisoner-of-war camp near Sagan in Nazi-occupied Poland. It was designed from the ground up to be inescapable, not just secure but architecturally engineered against escape at every level. Barracks raised on stilts so guards could see underneath them. Soil deliberately chosen for its bright yellow color, impossible to dispose of without immediately betraying that someone had been digging. Seismographic microphones buried around the entire perimeter to detect vibration from underground tunnels. The Germans were proud of it. They told the prisoners directly, "No one gets out of here." Squadron leader Roger Bushell heard that and began planning immediately. Bushell was a South African-born RAF officer, a veteran escape artist, and the kind of man who treated a Nazi prison camp as a tactical problem to be solved. He built an organization of over 600 prisoners, Americans, Britons, Canadians, Czechs, Norwegians, and divided them into specialized units: diggers, dispersers, forgers, tailors, security watchers. The operation was called the X organization, and it ran like a military command. They dug 3 tunnels simultaneously: Tom, Dick, Harry, each one 30 feet underground, deep enough to defeat the microphones, just 2 feet square in cross-section, and hundreds of feet in length. Between January and March 1944, the diggers removed 80 tons of yellow sand, hiding it in bags sewn inside their trousers and releasing it grain by grain during exercise walks. They shored the tunnel walls with 90 stolen bedboards. They wired the tunnel for electricity, tapped from the camp's own supply. They manufactured fake German uniforms, civilian clothes, and over 400 forged identity documents. Tom was discovered and destroyed in summer 1943. Everything shifted to Harry. On the night of March 24th, 76 men crawled through Harry into the Polish darkness. Only 3 made it home. The other 73 were all recaptured. Then Hitler issued a direct order: execute 50 of them. They were shot in small groups by the Gestapo, across Germany, across Poland, in one of the most documented war crimes of the entire conflict. Several of the officers responsible were later identified, tried at Nuremberg, and hanged. The youngest man executed was 21 years old. The Great Escape was not, in the end, about the men who made it out. It was about 600 men who decided, in the middle of Nazi Germany, that they were not going to stop trying. Jack Sheppard's 4 Escapes, 1724. Most people who break out of prison do it once. They plan for months, they risk everything, and if it works, they run and never look back. Jack Sheppard did it 4 times in a single year, and the 4th time, he walked out of London's most feared prison in leg irons so heavy that the guards hadn't bothered posting extra watch, because nobody, they reasoned, could move in those chains. Sheppard was a carpenter's apprentice from London's East End, young, charming, athletic, and spectacularly bad at staying out of trouble. He was a thief, but notably a non-violent one, which in 18th century England made him something of a working-class hero, at a time when most criminals were simply hanged and forgotten. His first escape came in April 1724. Arrested and locked in St. Giles's roundhouse, he broke through the ceiling within hours and lowered himself to the street on rope he'd braided from his own bedding. His second came weeks later from New Prison. He filed through his iron manacles with a smuggled tool and descended the outer wall on a bedsheet with his companion Bess Lyon. His third escape was from Newgate, which was a different category of institution entirely. Newgate was London's central criminal prison, dark, disease-ridden, and considered genuinely unbreakable. Sheppard was held in the condemned hold in heavy chains. He broke through the shackles, then forced his way through 6 consecutive locked and barred doors, navigating entirely in darkness by feel, before climbing to the roof and lowering himself down. They caught him again, put him back in Newgate, added heavier irons. He picked the leg irons, broke through the cell ceiling, reached the roof, and used a blanket as a rope. He was caught a final time in November 1724 and hanged at Tyburn. The crowd that gathered to watch, estimated at 200,000 people, was one of the largest in London's recorded history. They weren't there to celebrate his death. They were there because, for 1 year, honest Jack Sheppard had made every locked door in England look like a suggestion. Plays were written, operas were staged, 3 feature films followed. In the 1720s, he was the most famous man in Britain. Henri Charrière, Devil's Island, 1930s to 1941. The prison commandant at Devil's Island had a speech he gave to every new arrival. It went like this: "We have 2 guardians here, the jungle and the sea. If you don't get eaten by sharks or your bones picked clean by ants, you will beg to come back, and then you will be severely punished. He said it because the island didn't need walls. It didn't need guard towers. Devil's Island was a 3-square-mile rock off the coast of French Guiana, ringed by ocean currents so powerful and shark-infested waters so lethal that swimming was not escape. It was suicide delivered slowly. Henri Charrière arrived there having already tried to escape twice. He'd been convicted in Paris in 1931, wrongly, he always insisted, of murdering a gangster he'd never met. Sentenced to life and shipped to French Guiana, he made his first escape 42 days after landing. An open boat voyage of roughly 1,500 miles that took him to Colombia before French authorities recaptured him. For that, they gave him 2 years of solitary confinement, a stone cell, 30 minutes of daylight per week. Silence. When he emerged, he was transferred to Devil's Island, and instead of breaking, he began to watch the water. For months, Charrière studied the wave patterns off the island's cliffs. He noticed that every 7th wave in a particular swell sequence was powerful enough to carry a floating object clear of the rocks and out into open current. He built a raft from 2 bags of coconuts, nothing more, and on the day he judged the swell right, he carried it to the cliff edge, threw himself into the ocean, and let the sea decide. It carried him out. Days later, sunburned, half-starved, barely conscious, he washed ashore in Venezuela. He became a Venezuelan citizen. He married. He opened a restaurant in Caracas. In 1969, at 62 years old, he sat down and wrote it all from memory. The book, Papillon, sold 5 million copies in 16 languages. It was adapted into a major film starring Steve McQueen. Henri Charrière died in Madrid in 1973, a free man, 32 years after he threw himself off a cliff and trusted 2 bags of coconuts to do what no wall, no tunnel, and no plan had managed before. Sometimes the most terrifying escape isn't the most elaborate one. Sometimes it's just a man and a wave and the decision to jump.